Welcome, dear listeners, to a collection of timeless stories that speak to the deepest corners of the human heart. As you settle into the comfort of your evening rest, let these ancient tales of transformation guide you into peaceful reflection. Tonight we journey through stories of enemies who became brothers, of hatred transformed into love, and of the miraculous power of forgiveness that can bridge any divide. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let these stories of reconciliation carry you toward restful sleep. In the beginning, when the world was young and humanity took its first steps upon the earth, something profound was woven into the very fabric of human nature. Within each heart, two seeds were planted, one of love and one of discord. These seeds would grow throughout the ages, sometimes one stronger than the other, creating the eternal dance between harmony and conflict that defines our existence. The ancient scriptures tell us that conflict entered the world early, almost from the very moment when two brothers first walked the earth. Cain and Abel, the sons of Adam and Eve, showed us how quickly love can turn to jealousy, how swiftly brotherhood can transform into rivalry. Yet even in that first story of sibling discord, we see the seeds of a greater truth, that every conflict contains within it the possibility of redemption, every enemy the potential to become a friend. Throughout the generations that followed, this pattern would repeat itself countless times. Brothers would quarrel, friends would become foes, and nations would rise against nations. But woven through all these stories of division is a golden thread of hope, the possibility that what has been broken can be mended, that what has been separated can be reunited, and that those who have been enemies can indeed become brothers. The human heart is complex, capable of great love and terrible hatred, sometimes within the same moment. We are creatures of passion and pride, of fear and hope. We wound each other with words and deeds, often without meaning to, sometimes with full intention. We build walls between ourselves and others, brick by brick, grievance upon grievance, until we can no longer see the humanity in those we once loved. Yet there is something miraculous about the human capacity for forgiveness. Even when we have been deeply hurt, even when we feel justified in our anger, there remains within us a spark of divine grace that can kindle into the flame of reconciliation. This spark is what transforms enemies into friends, what turns bitter adversaries into beloved companions. The stories we are about to explore together are not mere ancient tales, but living examples of this transformative power. They show us that no hurt is too deep to heal, no betrayal too great to forgive, no enemy too bitter to love. They teach us that reconciliation is not just possible, but it is the very heart of what it means to be truly human. As we begin this journey together, we find ourselves in the ancient land of Canaan, where two brothers were born into a destiny that would test the very bonds of family and faith. Their story begins before their birth, in the prayers of a mother who longed for children and the promise of a father who believed in the impossible. Isaac and Rebekah had waited long for children, their hope growing thin with each passing year. When at last Rebekah conceived, the blessing seemed doubled. Twins stirred within her womb. But even before their birth, these children struggled with each other, wrestling in that dark and watery world as if they were already competing for something greater than space. When the time came for their birth, the first child emerged covered with hair like a garment, red as the earth from which his grandfather Adam had been formed. They called him Esau, and even as the midwife held him, his twin brother's hand grasped his heel, as if unwilling to let his brother claim the advantage of being firstborn. This second child they named Jacob, and from that first moment, their lives were intertwined in ways that would bring both blessing and sorrow. The boys grew up as different as summer and winter. Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the field who loved the wild places and the thrill of the chase. His hands were strong and rough, his voice loud and cheerful, his heart simple and direct. He lived in the moment, following his impulses wherever they led him, caring little for tomorrow when today offered such immediate pleasures. Jacob, by contrast, was quiet and thoughtful, preferring the safety of the tents to the uncertainty of the wilderness. He learned the ways of shepherding and trade, watching and listening, always thinking ahead to what might come. Where Esau acted on instinct, Jacob planned and calculated. Where Esau trusted, Jacob questioned. Their father Isaac loved Esau, delighting in the wild game his eldest son brought home from his hunts, proud of his strength and courage. But Rebekah's heart was drawn to Jacob, perhaps seeing in his quiet intensity something of the destiny that God had spoken over him before his birth. This division of affection would prove to be the first crack in the foundation of their family's peace. As the years passed, the difference in their temperaments led to a growing distance between the brothers. Esau saw Jacob as weak and scheming, always thinking instead of doing, always working an angle instead of facing life directly. Jacob saw Esau as reckless and foolish, throwing away precious things for momentary gratification, caring nothing for the deeper meanings and longer consequences of his choices. The first great rupture came on a day when Esau returned from hunting, exhausted and famished from days in the wilderness. The hunt had been unsuccessful, and he had eaten nothing but wild berries and stream water. As he approached the camp, the aroma of Jacob's cooking filled his nostrils, a rich, savoury stew of lentils and herbs that seemed like the most wonderful thing in the world to his empty stomach. "Please," Esau gasped, "let me have some of that red stew, for I am about to die of hunger." Jacob looked up from his cooking, and in that moment something calculating flickered in his eyes. Here was an opportunity he had perhaps been waiting for without knowing it. "Sell me your birthright first," he said quietly. Esau laughed, thinking it was a joke. "What good is a birthright to me if I die of starvation?" he said. "What use are future blessings to a dead man?" But Jacob was serious. "Swear to me first," he insisted, and Esau, driven by the immediate need of his body, and perhaps not fully understanding what he was giving away, swore an oath and sold his birthright to his younger brother for a bowl of stew. He ate and drank and went on his way, and the scripture tells us that he despised his birthright, thinking little of what he had traded away. But Jacob understood. In that moment, something precious had changed hands, not just the legal right to inherit as the firstborn, but something deeper. The birthright carried with it the spiritual leadership of the family, the responsibility to carry forward the promises that God had made to their grandfather Abraham and their father Isaac. It was a sacred trust, and now it belonged to Jacob. Years passed, and the memory of that transaction faded into the background of their daily lives. Esau continued to hunt and provide for the family, still his father's favourite. Jacob tended the flocks and managed the household affairs, still close to his mother's heart. On the surface, they maintained the forms of brotherhood, but underneath, something had changed. A barrier had been erected, invisible but real, between them. The final break came when their father Isaac grew old and his eyes grew dim. Feeling his mortality approaching, Isaac called for Esau to come to him. "My son," he said, "I am old and do not know the day of my death. Take your bow and arrows and go out to the field and hunt game for me, and prepare for me the savoury food that I love, and bring it to me so that I may eat, and my soul may bless you before I die." The blessing of the father was no small matter. It carried with it not just material inheritance, but spiritual authority and divine promise. It was the formal passing of the covenant from one generation to the next, and once given, it could not be taken back. Esau set out immediately to hunt for his father's meal, his heart full of love and anticipation. This would be his moment of triumph, the formal recognition of his place as the firstborn and heir. He ranged far into the wilderness, seeking the finest game he could find, wanting everything to be perfect for this sacred moment. But Rebekah had overheard Isaac's instructions to Esau, and her heart was troubled. She remembered the word that the Lord had spoken to her before the boys were born. 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, the older shall serve the younger. She believed that God intended Jacob to receive the blessing, not Esau, and she was determined to ensure that the divine will was accomplished. Quickly she went to Jacob and told him what she had heard. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice as I command you. Go to the flock and bring me 2 good young goats, so that I may prepare from them savory food for your father, such as he loves. And you shall take it to your father, so that he may eat and bless you before he dies. Jacob hesitated, fear and excitement warring in his heart. But my brother Esau is a hairy man, and I am a smooth man. Perhaps my father will feel me, and I shall seem to be deceiving him and bring a curse upon myself and not a blessing. But Rebekah was determined. Let your curse be on me, my son, she said. Only obey my voice and go. Bring them to me. So Jacob brought the goats, and Rebekah prepared the savory food that Isaac loved. Then she took the best garments of Esau and put them on Jacob, and she covered his hands and the smooth part of his neck with the skins of the young goats. The deception was elaborate and desperate, born of a mother's conviction that she was serving God's purpose and a son's desire for his father's blessing. When Jacob approached his father with the food, his heart pounding with fear and guilt, Isaac was suspicious. "How is it that you have found it so quickly, my son?" he asked. "Because the Lord your God granted me success," Jacob replied, and even as he spoke the words, he felt the weight of the lie and the truth mixed together in ways he could not understand. Isaac was troubled. The voice sounded like Jacob's voice, but the hands felt like Esau's hands. "Are you really my son Esau?" he asked. "I am," Jacob replied, and with those words he crossed a line from which there would be no easy return. Isaac ate the food and drank the wine, and then he called Jacob near to kiss him. As he smelled the scent of Esau's garments on Jacob's body, he was convinced, and he pronounced the blessing, "See, the smell of my son is as the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. May God give you of the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth and plenty of grain and wine. Let people serve you, and nations bow down to you. Be lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you." The words fell like gold upon Jacob's head, and he knew that something irreversible had happened. The blessing was his now, for better or worse, and all the promises and responsibilities that came with it. But no sooner had Jacob left his father's presence than Esau returned from his hunt, his heart full of joy and anticipation. He prepared the savory food and brought it to Isaac, saying, "Let my father arise and eat of his son's game, so that you may bless me." Isaac trembled violently when he realized what had happened. "Who was it then that hunted game and brought it to me, and I ate it all before you came, and I have blessed him? Yes, and he shall be blessed." When Esau heard his father's words, he cried out with an exceedingly great and bitter cry, and said, "Bless me, even me also, O my father." The anguish in his voice could have broken stones, and Isaac wept as he heard it. "Your brother came deceitfully, and he has taken away your blessing," Isaac said, and those words fell between the brothers like a sword, cutting the last threads that had held them together. Esau's grief turned to rage. "Is he not rightly named Jacob?" he said bitterly, "for he has cheated me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and behold, now he has taken away my blessing." Isaac did bless Esau, but it was a lesser blessing, a harder path. "Behold, away from the fatness of the earth shall your dwelling be, and away from the dew of heaven on high. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. But when you grow restless, you shall break his yoke from your neck." That night, Esau's heart burned with hatred for his brother. "The days of mourning for my father are approaching," he said to himself. "Then I will kill my brother Jacob." The words came from a place of such deep pain and betrayal that they seemed to sear his very soul as he spoke them. But Rebekah heard of Esau's intention, and she knew that she had to act quickly to save both her sons, Jacob from Esau's violence and Esau from the guilt of fratricide. She went to Jacob and said, "Behold, your brother Esau comforts himself about you by planning to kill you. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice. Arise, flee to Laban my brother in Haran, and stay with him a while, until your brother's fury turns away and he forgets what you have done to him." So Jacob fled into the night, carrying nothing but his staff and the weight of his deception. Behind him he left a broken family, a grieving father, and a brother whose love had turned to murderous hate. Ahead lay the unknown wilderness, and a journey that would take him far from everything he had ever known. As he walked through the darkness, Jacob must have wondered if the blessing he had gained was worth the price he had paid. He had won his father's inheritance, but he had lost his brother's love. He had secured his future, but he had destroyed his present. The victory felt hollow in his mouth, bitter as wormwood, cold as stone. This was how enemies were made, not in a moment of dramatic confrontation, but through a series of small compromises, petty jealousies, and accumulating hurts. A bowl of stew, a stolen blessing, a family torn apart by favoritism and deception. The seeds of conflict that had been planted in their mother's womb had finally grown into a harvest of hatred. Yet even in that dark hour, as Jacob walked alone under the stars, carrying his guilt and fear into exile, the story was far from over. For there are forces at work in the universe stronger than human hatred, deeper than human hurt. There is a love that can heal any wound, a grace that can overcome any sin, a mercy that can transform any enemy into a friend. But that transformation would take time, much time. 20 years would pass before the brothers would meet again. 20 years of separation and growth, of trials and revelations, of wrestling with God and with themselves. The boy who fled in the night would return as a man transformed, and the brother who had planned murder would discover that his heart too had been changed by the passing years. For now, though, there was only the darkness, the lonely road, and the long journey that lay ahead. Jacob walked on through the night, each step taking him further from his past and closer to a destiny he could not yet imagine. Behind him, Esau stood in the doorway of his father's tent, watching his brother's figure disappear into the darkness, his own heart wrestling with emotions too complex for words. The separation had begun, but separation, as we shall see, is sometimes the first step toward reconciliation. Sometimes we must lose our brothers before we can truly find them again. Sometimes the road that leads us away from home is the only path that can eventually bring us back. The years of exile stretched before Jacob like an endless desert, each day a test of endurance, each night a wrestling with regret. He had gained the world, as it seemed, but lost his soul, and the price of his deception would be paid in loneliness and longing, in the slow, patient work of becoming the man he was meant to be. But God, who sees the end from the beginning, who can write straight with crooked lines, was already at work in both brothers' hearts, preparing them for a reunion that would heal not just their relationship, but their very souls. The story of their enmity was ending, though they did not yet know it, and the story of their brotherhood was about to begin. 20 long years would pass like water flowing over stones, slowly wearing away the sharp edges of anger and pain, gradually smoothing the jagged wounds of betrayal into something softer, something that could eventually become wisdom. These were years of transformation for both brothers, though they walked separate paths and breathed different air under the same vast sky. For Jacob, the journey to his uncle Laban's house in Haran was more than a physical migration. It was a pilgrimage of the soul. Each mile he travelled carried him not just away from danger, but deeper into himself, into the hidden places where his true character would be tested and refined. The comfortable life he had known in his father's house gave way to the harsh realities of survival, the protection of family replaced by the vulnerability of exile. On his first night away from home, as he lay with his head upon a stone pillow under the endless canopy of stars, Jacob experienced something that would change the trajectory of his entire life. In his dreams, he saw a ladder stretching from earth to heaven, with angels ascending and descending upon it. And at the top of the ladder stood the Lord himself, speaking words that would echo in Jacob's heart for decades to come. "I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac," the voice said, warm and terrible and infinitely loving. "The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." When Jacob awoke from his sleep, he was afraid, and he said, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." He took the stone that had been his pillow and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it, naming the place Bethel, the house of God. And there he made a vow. "If God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God." This encounter marked the beginning of Jacob's true spiritual journey. The God who had spoken to his grandfather Abraham and his father Isaac had now spoken directly to him, not with condemnation for his deceptions, but with promises of blessing and protection. It was a grace he had not expected and did not feel he deserved, yet it wrapped around him like a warm cloak in the cold night of his exile. When Jacob finally reached Haran and found his mother's family, he discovered that his uncle Laban was a man who could match him stratagem for stratagem, deception for deception. Jacob had come seeking a place of refuge and perhaps an easy life, but instead he found himself entering into a complex relationship that would teach him what it felt like to be on the receiving end of trickery and manipulation. Jacob fell in love with Laban's younger daughter Rachel, beautiful and graceful, with eyes that seemed to hold all the light of dawn. He worked 7 years to earn her hand in marriage, and those years seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. But on the wedding night, Laban substituted his elder daughter Leah for Rachel, and Jacob found himself married to the wrong woman. The bitter irony was not lost on him. He who had deceived his father by pretending to be his older brother was now deceived by a father-in-law who substituted an older daughter for a younger one. The symmetry of divine justice was both painful and perfect, and Jacob began to understand that his actions had consequences that reached far beyond what he had imagined. Laban explained his deception with words that must have cut deeply. "It is not so done in our country, to give the younger before the firstborn." The very principle Jacob had violated in taking Esau's blessing was now being used to trap him in an unwanted marriage. He could work another 7 years for Rachel, Laban said, and Jacob, burning with love and indignation, agreed. So Jacob served 14 years for 2 wives, and in those years he learned patience in ways he had never imagined. He learned to tend flocks in the burning heat of summer and the bitter cold of winter. He learned to protect sheep from wild animals and thieves. He learned to negotiate with a man who could twist words as easily as Jacob himself once had. Most importantly, he learned what it meant to be faithful in small things, day after day, year after year. The work was hard and often thankless. Laban changed Jacob's wages 10 times, always seeking to gain advantage over his nephew. But something remarkable happened during these years of labor and frustration. Jacob's character began to change. The smooth-skinned young man who had stolen his brother's blessing became weathered and strong, his hands rough with honest work, his heart tempered by suffering and responsibility. He became the father of many children, and through the rivalry between his wives Leah and Rachel, he experienced firsthand the pain that comes when love is divided, when favoritism creates jealousy and strife within a family. Each time he saw his children competing for his attention, he must have remembered his own childhood. The way his parents' divided affections had poisoned the relationship between him and Esau. Leah bore him 6 sons and a daughter, though she knew she was not the wife of his heart. Rachel remained barren for many years, and her pain was Jacob's pain, her longing his longing. When at last she bore him Joseph, Jacob's joy was complete, but it came tinged with the knowledge of how much sorrow had preceded it. Through all these experiences, Jacob was learning empathy in ways he had never known as a young man living comfortably in his father's house. He was learning what it meant to be the victim of deception, to have his labor exploited, to love someone who could not love him back in the same measure. He was learning, though he may not have realized it at the time, what it meant to forgive. As the years passed, Jacob prospered despite Laban's attempts to cheat him. His flocks grew large and healthy, his family expanded, and his reputation as a skilled shepherd spread throughout the region. But more important than his material success was the gradual transformation of his heart. The calculating young man who had traded a bowl of stew for a birthright was becoming someone deeper, wiser, more compassionate. Yet even as Jacob grew and changed, his thoughts often turned toward home, toward the family he had left behind, toward the brother he had wronged. He would wonder what had become of Esau, whether his anger had cooled with time, whether he had married and had children of his own. Sometimes Jacob would catch himself scanning the horizon, half expecting to see a familiar figure approaching, though he knew Esau was hundreds of miles away. The longing for reconciliation grew stronger with each passing year. Success and prosperity could not fill the void left by broken relationships. Jacob had gained much during his time with Laban, but he had never stopped feeling like an exile, a man cut off from his roots, incomplete without the brother he had lost. Meanwhile, back in the land of Canaan, Esau too was changing and growing. The young man whose heart had burned with murderous rage gradually matured into someone different, someone capable of deeper reflection and understanding. The shock of losing his father's blessing had been devastating, but it had also forced him to find his own path, to discover his own strengths and create his own destiny. Esau became the leader of a great clan, a man respected for his courage and strength. He moved south to the land of Seir, where he could have room for his growing herds and his expanding family. He married and became the father of many children, building a legacy that was different from what he had originally expected, but no less valuable. As the years wore on, Esau's anger toward Jacob began to fade, replaced by a kind of weariness and, eventually, a growing curiosity about his twin brother. He had heard reports from traders and travelers about Jacob's success in Haran, about his large family and prosperous flocks. Part of him felt proud of his brother's achievements, though that pride was still mixed with hurt and confusion. The memory of their childhood began to soften around the edges. Esau remembered not just the betrayal, but also the times they had played together as boys, the times Jacob had helped him with tasks that required patience and careful thought, the times they had worked side by side in companionable silence. He began to wonder if the brother he remembered was the same person who had deceived their father, or if there had been complexities he had not understood at the time. Isaac grew old and frail, and both brothers knew that their father would not live forever. The thought of Isaac dying with his sons estranged was a weight that pressed heavily on both their hearts. Neither wanted to be the one to make the first move toward reconciliation, but neither could bear the thought of permanent separation. After 20 years in Haran, Jacob began to feel a stirring in his heart, a sense that his time of exile was coming to an end. The Lord appeared to him again and said, "Return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you." The command was clear, but the prospect was terrifying. How could he return to face the brother he had wronged, especially now that he had so much to lose? Wives, children, servants, flocks. Yet Jacob knew he could not ignore the divine calling. He began to make preparations for the journey home, gathering his family and possessions, planning the long trek across the desert. But as the day of departure approached, his anxiety grew. What if Esau still hated him? What if his brother had spent these 20 years planning revenge? What if he was leading his entire family into danger? Laban was reluctant to let Jacob go, recognizing that his nephew's presence had brought blessing to his household. But when Jacob explained that God had called him to return to his homeland, Laban could not argue. They made a covenant of peace, setting up a pillar of stones as a witness between them, and then Jacob set out on the road that would take him back to his past and forward to his destiny. The journey home was long and arduous, complicated by the needs of small children and pregnant women, by the management of large flocks and herds. But with each mile that brought them closer to Canaan, Jacob felt both excitement and dread building in his chest. Soon he would have to face Esau, and everything would depend on how that meeting went. As they neared the border of Esau's territory, Jacob sent messengers ahead with carefully crafted words. "Thus says your servant Jacob, I have sojourned with Laban and stayed until now. I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, male servants, and female servants. I have sent to tell my Lord, in order that I may find favor in your sight." The messengers returned with news that struck terror into Jacob's heart. "We came to your brother Esau, and he is coming to meet you, and there are 400 men with him." 400 men. It sounded like an army, like a force prepared for war rather than welcome. That night Jacob's fear reached its peak. He divided his company into 2 camps, thinking that if Esau attacked one, the other might escape. He prepared an elaborate gift of hundreds of animals to send ahead to his brother, hoping to appease his anger. But even as he made these practical preparations, he knew that the real battle was not with Esau, but with himself, with his own guilt and fear and pride. And so Jacob did what he had never done before in quite the same way. He threw himself completely upon God's mercy. "O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac," he prayed. "O Lord, who said to me, 'Return to your country and to your kindred, that I may do you good.' I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come and attack me, the mothers with the children." It was perhaps the most honest prayer Jacob had ever prayed, stripped of pretense and calculation, raw with genuine humility and desperate need. He acknowledged his unworthiness, confessed his fear, and cast himself completely upon divine grace. The smooth-tongued young man who had once manipulated his way to blessing was now a mature man learning to trust in a goodness greater than his own cleverness. That night, after sending his family and possessions across the river Jabbok, Jacob remained alone on the far side. In that solitude, wrestling with his fears and his past, he encountered a mysterious figure who fought with him until the breaking of the day. All night they struggled, neither able to overcome the other, until finally the stranger touched Jacob's hip and put it out of joint. "Let me go, for the day has broken," the stranger said. But Jacob, even wounded and exhausted, would not release his grip. "I will not let you go unless you bless me," he gasped. "What is your name?" the stranger asked. "Jacob," he replied, and in speaking his own name, he He was acknowledging all that it meant: supplanter, deceiver, the one who grasps at heels. "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel," the stranger declared, "for you have striven with God and with men, and have prevailed." In that moment, Jacob understood that he had been wrestling not just with a mysterious visitor, but with God himself. He had been renamed, transformed from Jacob the supplanter into Israel, the one who wrestles with God. The blessing he received was not one he had stolen or manipulated, but one that came through honest struggle, through refusing to let go even when wounded. As the sun rose over the river, Jacob limped across to rejoin his family, forever marked by his encounter with the divine. He was no longer the same man who had fled his brother's anger 20 years before. He was Israel now, one who had wrestled with God and emerged victorious not through his own strength, but through his refusal to give up, his persistence in seeking blessing even when it cost him everything. The transformation was complete, but the test was still ahead. Soon he would see Esau approaching with 400 men, and everything he had learned about faith and forgiveness and the mercy of God would be put to the ultimate trial. The boy who had stolen a blessing was about to discover whether the man he had become was worthy of the grace he had received. The morning sun cast long shadows across the landscape as Jacob, now Israel, arranged his family for the encounter that would determine their fate. His limp from the night's wrestling reminded him with each step that he was no longer the same man who had fled 20 years before. But it also reminded him that some struggles leave permanent marks, visible signs of invisible transformations. He placed his servants and their children first, then Leah and her children, and finally Rachel and Joseph last, furthest from potential danger. It was a father's careful calculation, born of love and fear in equal measure. As he walked ahead of them all, his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Then in the distance he saw them, a cloud of dust rising from the earth, and within it the unmistakable figures of men on horseback and on foot. 400 of them, just as the messengers had reported. At their head rode a figure Jacob recognized, even at a distance, broad-shouldered and powerful, moving with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to command. Esau. 20 years collapsed into nothing as Jacob looked upon his brother's approach. He was no longer the young hunter who had sold his birthright for a meal, but a mature leader, a man who had built his own kingdom in the southern wilderness. The sight of him was both familiar and strange, like looking at a reflection in water that has been disturbed by wind. Jacob bowed himself to the ground 7 times as he approached his brother, each bow a deliberate act of humility, a public acknowledgement of wrongdoing, a plea for mercy without words. The gestures came from a heart that had learned the true cost of pride, from a soul that valued reconciliation more than dignity. But what happened next was something Jacob could never have expected, something that made all his careful planning and fearful preparation seem suddenly unnecessary. Esau ran to meet him, and instead of drawing a sword or raising his hand in anger, he threw his arms around Jacob's neck and kissed him. And they both wept. The tears that flowed between the brothers carried 20 years of separation, 2 decades of wondering and regret and longing. They were tears of relief and recognition, of grief for time lost and joy for grace found. In that moment, all the careful words Jacob had prepared, all the explanations and justifications and pleas became irrelevant. The language of reconciliation was being spoken in a vocabulary older than words. "Who are these with you?" Esau asked, looking with wonder at the large family that Jacob had brought with him. "The children whom God has graciously given your servant," Jacob replied, and there was something new in his voice, a gentleness and humility that had not been there in his youth. One by one he presented his wives and children to Esau, and each group came forward and bowed respectfully to their uncle. Esau's eyes softened as he looked upon his brother's family. Here was Jacob, not as the scheming younger brother he remembered, but as a father and husband, a man who had built a life and taken responsibility for others. The sight stirred something protective and warm in Esau's heart, dissolving the last remnants of old resentment. "What do you mean by all this company that I met?" Esau asked, referring to the elaborate gift of livestock that Jacob had sent ahead. "To find favor in the sight of my Lord," Jacob replied, still unable to quite believe that his brother's forgiveness could be so complete, so freely given. But Esau would have none of it. "I have enough, my brother," he said, and in those simple words was a wealth of meaning. He had enough material wealth, yes, but more than that, he had enough anger, enough resentment, enough separation. He was ready to be brothers again. "Keep what you have for yourself." Jacob pressed him to accept the gift, saying, "Please, if I have found favor in your sight, then accept my present from my hand. For I have seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God, and you have accepted me." The comparison was not accidental or merely poetic. Jacob had wrestled with God through the night and received blessing and forgiveness. Now he was seeing that same divine grace reflected in his brother's face, that same unmerited mercy flowing through human channels. Finally, Esau accepted the gift, not because he needed it, but because he understood that Jacob needed to give it, needed to make some tangible gesture of repentance and restoration. The gift was less about the animals themselves than about what they represented: acknowledgement of wrong, desire for reconciliation, hope for a shared future. Esau suggested that they travel together, that he would accompany Jacob on his journey. But Jacob, still protective of his young children and pregnant wives, gently declined. "My Lord knows that the children are frail, and that the nursing flocks and herds are a care to me," he explained. "If they are driven hard for one day, all the flocks will die. Let my Lord pass on ahead of his servant, and I will lead on slowly, according to the pace of the livestock that are ahead of me, and according to the pace of the children, until I come to my Lord in Seir." It was a wise and diplomatic response, but it also revealed something deeper. Jacob was no longer the young man who acted on impulse or took unnecessary risks. He had learned to balance his desires with his responsibilities, to consider the needs of those who depended on him. The reunion with Esau was wonderful, but it could not solve all problems or erase all consequences. Life had to be lived with patience and wisdom, not just with emotion and enthusiasm. Esau offered to leave some of his men with Jacob for protection, but Jacob declined this as well, saying simply, "Let me find favor in the sight of my Lord." He had learned to trust in divine protection rather than in human force, to walk by faith rather than by the assurance of armed guards. So the brothers parted again, but this time in peace, with blessing instead of cursing, with hope instead of hatred. Esau returned to his home in Seir, his heart light with the joy of reconciliation. Jacob continued on his journey, but the weight that had pressed upon his shoulders for 20 years was gone, lifted by the grace of a brother's forgiveness. As Esau rode south with his 400 men, he must have reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. The blessing he had lost had seemed so important at the time, the defining moment of his identity and destiny. But the man he had become was not diminished by that loss. He had found his own path, built his own legacy, discovered his own strength. Perhaps the blessing had gone to the right brother after all. Perhaps God's plans were wiser than human understanding. The encounter by the river had changed something fundamental in both brothers. For Jacob, it was the final confirmation that his transformation was real, that the man he had become through 20 years of struggle and growth was acceptable not just to God, but to the brother he had wronged. For Esau, it was the discovery that forgiveness could be more satisfying than revenge, that mercy could be more powerful than justice. They would meet again years later, when their father Isaac died, and they would stand together beside his grave, no longer as enemies, but as sons united in their grief and their love for the man who had given them life. The inheritance they had once fought over would seem small compared to the brotherhood they had recovered, the peace they had found, the grace they had both learned to give and receive. Jacob settled for a time in the land near Shechem, building an altar and calling it El Elohe Israel, God, the God of Israel. It was a declaration and a remembrance, a way of marking the place where his new identity had been confirmed, where his past had been reconciled with his present, where his fears had been replaced by faith. The story of Jacob and Esau became a testimony to all who heard it, a proof that no relationship is too broken to heal, no hurt too deep to forgive, no enemy too bitter to become a friend. Their reconciliation was not just a personal victory, but a glimpse of divine possibility, a small reflection of the great reconciliation that God desires to accomplish between himself and humanity, between people and their neighbours, between the warring parts of every human heart. Yet even as we celebrate this triumph of grace over grievance, we must remember that such reconciliation does not come easily or automatically. It required 20 years of growth and change, of suffering and learning, of wrestling with God and with themselves. It required both brothers to become different people than they had been in their youth, to mature beyond their early hurts and selfish desires. The path from enmity to brotherhood is rarely straight or simple. It winds through valleys of humiliation and over mountains of pride. It demands that we face our own failures honestly, that we release our grip on old grievances, that we choose mercy over justice and love over law. But those who complete the journey discover something precious beyond measure. They discover that the brother they thought they had lost forever was waiting for them all along, ready to run toward them with arms wide open, ready to weep tears of joy instead of sorrow. This ancient story speaks across the centuries to every human heart that has known the pain of broken relationships, the weight of unforgiven sin, the longing for reconciliation. It whispers hope to those who think they have gone too far to return, who believe their actions have placed them beyond the reach of grace. It proclaims that no one is irredeemable, no relationship beyond repair, no love beyond resurrection. The embrace of Jacob and Esau beside the river stands as one of the most beautiful moments in all of human literature, a tableau of forgiveness that has inspired countless acts of reconciliation throughout history. In their tears, we see our own longing for peace. In their reunion, we glimpse the possibility of healing for our own broken relationships. In their joy, we taste the sweetness of grace that can transform any enemy into a friend. As the brothers went their separate ways after that day by the river, they carried with them not just the memory of reconciliation, but the living reality of love renewed. They had learned one of life's most important lessons, that forgiveness is not just a gift we give to others, but a gift we give to ourselves, freeing us from the prison of resentment and opening our hearts to the fullness of life. Their story would echo through the generations, told and retold around campfires and in synagogues, in churches and in homes, wherever people gathered to remember that love is stronger than hate, that grace is more powerful than grievance, that brothers can indeed be found again, no matter how far they have wandered or how long they have been lost. But the lessons of reconciliation would need to be learned anew by each generation, for the human heart seems destined to repeat the ancient patterns of jealousy and betrayal, of love divided and brotherhood broken. Even as Jacob rejoiced in his reunion with Esau, the seeds of another family conflict were already being planted in his own household, in the favoritism he showed to one particular son among the many children God had given him. Years passed in relative peace after Jacob's return to Canaan. He settled in the land of his fathers, tending his flocks and raising his family. His sons grew to manhood, each developing his own personality and gifts, each finding his place in the complex dynamics of a large household. But among all his children, there was one who held a special place in Jacob's heart, one whose very existence seemed to Jacob like a miracle of grace. Joseph was the firstborn son of Rachel, the wife Jacob had loved most deeply, the woman for whom he had worked 14 years and whom he had nearly lost to barrenness. When Joseph was born, it was as if Jacob's deepest prayers had been answered, as if God had rewarded his patient faithfulness with a gift beyond measure. And when Rachel died giving birth to Benjamin, Joseph became even more precious to his father, a living reminder of the love that had defined Jacob's adult years. Jacob could not help but favour Joseph over his other sons, though he had learned from his own childhood how dangerous such favouritism could be. He made Joseph a robe of many colours, a garment that marked him as special, as chosen, as different from his brothers. It was a beautiful gift, woven with love and pride, but it carried within its threads the potential for terrible division. Joseph, blessed with unusual gifts of intelligence and perception, seemed to understand that he was destined for something greater than the ordinary life of a shepherd. At 17, he began to have dreams that revealed a future so extraordinary that he could barely comprehend it himself. In one dream, he and his brothers were binding sheaves in the field, and his sheaf rose up and stood upright while his brothers' sheaves bowed down to it. In another, the sun and moon and 11 stars bowed down to him. With the thoughtless honesty of youth, Joseph shared these dreams with his family, not understanding how they would sound to brothers who already resented his favoured position. To them, the dreams seemed like arrogant boasting, confirmation of what they had suspected all along, that Joseph thought himself better than they were, that he expected to rule over them. "Are you indeed to reign over us?" they asked bitterly. "Or are you indeed to dominion over us?" And they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. The brothers saw Joseph as a spoiled child who had been given everything he wanted while they worked hard in the fields and received little recognition. They saw the beautiful robe their father had made for him and remembered their own plain garments. They heard Jacob speak of Joseph with pride and affection and contrasted it with the more measured attention they received. Day by day, their resentment grew like a slow poison in their hearts. Even Jacob was troubled by Joseph's second dream, the one in which the sun and moon and stars bowed down to him. "What is this dream that you have dreamed?" he asked. "Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?" But though he rebuked Joseph for the dream, the scripture tells us that he kept the saying in his mind, pondering what it might mean. The tension in the household grew thicker with each passing day. Joseph, unaware of the depth of his brother's hatred, continued to move among them with the confidence of one who knew himself beloved. His brothers watched him with eyes that grew darker and more resentful, their hearts hardening against him like clay baked in a furnace. The crisis came when Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers, who were pasturing the flocks near Shechem. It was a simple errand, the kind of task that might be given to any son, but to the brothers it seemed like another example of Joseph being sent to spy on them, to report back to their father about their activities. When they saw Joseph approaching from a distance, his colourful robe making him unmistakable, even at a great distance, something dark and terrible stirred in their hearts. "Here comes this dreamer," they said to one another. "Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams." The words hung in the air like a curse, and for a moment it seemed as if fraternal hatred might triumph completely, as if the pattern of Cain and Abel might repeat itself in this new generation. But Reuben, the eldest, still had enough conscience left to recoil from outright murder. "Let us not take his life," he said. "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him." Reuben intended to come back later and rescue Joseph, to return him safely to their father, but his brothers did not know this. When Joseph reached them, full of eager questions about their welfare and the condition of the flocks, they fell upon him without warning. They stripped off the robe of many colours, that symbol of their father's favouritism that had tormented them for so long. Then they seized him and threw him into an empty cistern, its walls too high and smooth for him to climb out. As Joseph called out from the depths of the pit, his voice echoing off the stone walls, his brothers sat down to eat their meal. The casual cruelty of this act speaks to how completely their hearts had hardened against him. They could listen to their brother's cries for help while they ate bread and cheese, as if his suffering were no more significant than the bleating of sheep. But Providence was at work even in this dark moment, even in the midst of such callous betrayal. A caravan of Ishmaelite traders appeared on the horizon, their camels loaded with spices and precious goods, travelling the ancient trade route from Gilead down to Egypt. Judah, perhaps sensing an opportunity, or perhaps stirred by some remnant of conscience, spoke up with a suggestion that would change everything. "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood?" he said. "Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." It was not mercy exactly, but it was something less than murder. The brothers agreed, and when the traders came near, they pulled Joseph up out of the pit and sold him for 20 pieces of silver. Joseph's cries of anguish as he was bound and led away would haunt his brothers for years to come. They had expected to feel satisfaction, to feel that justice had been done, that the favoured son had finally received his comeuppance. Instead, they felt only emptiness and a growing dread of what they had unleashed. To cover their crime, they took Joseph's robe and dipped it in goat's blood, then brought it to their father. "This we have found," they said. "Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not." Jacob recognized it immediately, and his cry of grief tore through the household like a blade. "It is my son's robe," he wailed. "A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." He tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son, mourning." The brothers had achieved their goal. Joseph was gone, and they would no longer have to endure his dreams or his favoured status. But the victory was bitter as wormwood in their mouths. They watched their father's grief and knew that they were responsible for it. They had silenced Joseph's voice, but they could not silence the voice of their own consciences, which spoke to them day and night of their guilt. Meanwhile, far to the south, Joseph was learning what it meant to be a slave in a foreign land. The journey to Egypt was a nightmare of heat and dust and despair, bound like an animal, treated as merchandise, torn away from everything he had ever known or loved. The boy who had dreamed of ruling over his brothers was now discovering what it felt like to be powerless, to be owned by strangers, to have his very life depend on the whims of others. But even in slavery, Joseph's character began to shine through. He was sold to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, and even in this reduced circumstance, his intelligence and integrity made him valuable. Potiphar saw that the Lord was with Joseph, and that everything he did prospered, and he made Joseph overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. Joseph's time in Potiphar's house taught him skills he would never have learned as a favoured son in his father's household. He learned to manage a large estate, to handle money and resources, to navigate the complex politics of an Egyptian household. He learned languages and customs, developed diplomatic skills, discovered strengths he had never known he possessed. When Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him and Joseph refused, choosing integrity over advancement, he was falsely accused and thrown into prison. It seemed like another devastating blow, another step further away from the dreams of his youth. But even in prison, Joseph's gifts could not be hidden. The The keeper of the prison put him in charge of all the prisoners, and whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. Years passed, and Joseph interpreted dreams for his fellow prisoners, including Pharaoh's butler and baker. When the butler was restored to his position, Joseph asked him to remember him before Pharaoh, but the butler forgot, and Joseph remained in prison 2 more years. It seemed as if he had been abandoned not just by his family, but by God himself. But those years in prison were not wasted. They were years of refinement, of learning patience and perseverance, of developing the depth of character that would be needed for the extraordinary destiny that awaited him. The boy who had been proud of his dreams was becoming a man who could bear the weight of their fulfillment. When Pharaoh himself began to have disturbing dreams that none of his magicians could interpret, the butler finally remembered Joseph. Hastily summoned from prison, washed and shaved and clothed in proper garments, Joseph stood before the most powerful man in the known world and interpreted dreams that would change the course of history. 7 years of plenty would be followed by 7 years of famine, Joseph told Pharaoh. The plenty would be so great that the years of famine would be forgotten, but the famine would be so severe that it would consume all the abundance that had come before. Egypt must prepare now, storing grain during the good years to survive the lean ones that would follow. Pharaoh was convinced, and more than that, he was impressed by Joseph's wisdom and obvious integrity. "Can we find a man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God?" he asked his servants. Then he turned to Joseph and said, "Since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you." In a single day, Joseph went from being a forgotten prisoner to being the second most powerful man in Egypt. Pharaoh gave him his signet ring, clothed him in fine linen, put a gold chain around his neck, and made him ride in his second chariot. The dreams of his youth, which had seemed so arrogant and impossible, were beginning to come true in ways he could never have imagined. Joseph threw himself into his new responsibilities with wisdom and energy. During the 7 years of plenty, he travelled throughout Egypt, organising the collection and storage of grain. He married Asenath, the daughter of an Egyptian priest, and she bore him 2 sons. He named the firstborn Manasseh, saying, "God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house." The second he named Ephraim, saying, "God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction." The names revealed something profound about Joseph's spiritual journey. He had found a way to let go of the pain of his past while still holding on to hope for the future. He had learned to see God's hand even in the most difficult circumstances, to trust that divine providence was working even when it was invisible to human eyes. When the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had predicted, the abundance of Egypt became a source of salvation not just for the Egyptians, but for all the surrounding nations. People came from far and wide to buy grain, and among them, eventually, came 10 brothers from the land of Canaan, sent by their aging father to purchase food for their starving families. The famine had been severe in Canaan, as it was throughout the known world. Jacob's household, once prosperous with large flocks and herds, found themselves facing starvation. The old man, now called Israel, heard that there was grain in Egypt and said to his sons, "Why do you look at one another? Behold, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down and buy grain for us there, that we may live and not die." So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to Egypt to buy grain, but Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's full brother, and the only other son of his beloved Rachel. Lest perhaps some harm befall him, Jacob said, still haunted by the loss of Joseph all those years before, still protective of this last connection to the wife he had loved most deeply. When the brothers arrived in Egypt and were brought before the governor who controlled the distribution of grain, they bowed down before him with their faces to the ground, just as Joseph had dreamed so many years before. but they did not recognize him. How could they? The 17-year-old boy they had sold into slavery was now a man of 39, dressed in Egyptian finery, speaking Egyptian, wielding power they could scarcely comprehend. But Joseph recognized them immediately. 22 years had passed since that terrible day by the pit, but their faces were burned into his memory. Time seemed to collapse as he looked upon them, and for a moment he was again the frightened boy crying out from the bottom of a cistern while his brothers ate their meal above. A storm of emotions swept through Joseph's heart. Pain, anger, grief, and underneath it all, a love that had never died despite everything they had done to him. He could have revealed himself immediately, could have ordered their execution, could have taken any number of revenges. Instead, he chose to test them, to discover what kind of men they had become in the years since their betrayal. Speaking through an interpreter, Joseph accused them of being spies. "No, my lord," they protested. "Your servants have come to buy food. We are all sons of one man. We are honest men. Your servants have never been spies." "No," Joseph insisted, "it is to see the nakedness of the land that you have come." In their desperation to convince him, the brothers revealed more than they intended. "Your servants are 12 brothers, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan," they said. "And behold, the youngest is this day with our father, and one is no more." The phrase "one is no more" cut through Joseph like a knife. So that was how they had explained his disappearance, how they had justified his absence to themselves and others. He was simply gone, erased from their family history, as if he had never existed at all. Joseph decided to put them to a test that would reveal the true state of their hearts. "If you are honest men," he said, "let one of your brothers remain confined here, while the rest of you go and carry grain for the famine of your households. But bring your youngest brother to me, so your words may be verified, and you may not die." The brothers were terrified. They had come seeking grain, and now found themselves suspected of espionage, with one of their number to be held hostage until they could prove their honesty. As they discussed their predicament among themselves, speaking in Hebrew and thinking the Egyptian governor could not understand them, they revealed the guilt that had haunted them for over 2 decades. "In truth, we are guilty concerning our brother," they said to one another, "in that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us, and we did not listen. That is why this distress has come upon us." Reuben, who had tried to save Joseph all those years ago, spoke with bitter satisfaction. "Did I not tell you not to sin against the boy? But you did not listen. So now there comes a reckoning for his blood." Joseph heard every word, and he turned away from them and wept. The tears were for the pain they had all endured, for the years of separation and suffering, for the guilt his brothers had carried and the grief his father had borne. But they were also tears of a different kind, tears of hope, because in their words he heard something he had not dared expect, genuine remorse, real acknowledgement of their wrong. When Joseph composed himself and turned back to them, he selected Simeon to remain in Egypt as their guarantee, binding him before their eyes. Then he commanded his servants to fill their sacks with grain, to replace every man's money in his sack, and to give them provisions for their journey home. The discovery of the money in their sacks filled the brothers with even greater terror. "What is this that God has done to us?" they asked one another, recognizing somehow that they were caught up in something far greater than a simple business transaction, something that felt like divine judgment or divine mercy, though they could not tell which. When they returned to their father and told him all that had happened, Jacob's heart was filled with anguish. The governor of Egypt wanted to see Benjamin, but Jacob could not bear the thought of risking his youngest son. "Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more," he lamented, "and now you would take Benjamin. All this has come against me." Reuben offered to guarantee Benjamin's safety with the lives of his own 2 sons, but Jacob refused. "My son shall not go down with you," he said, "for his brother is dead, and he is the only one left. If harm should happen to him on the journey that you are to make, you would bring down my grey hairs with sorrow to Sheol." But the famine continued, and eventually their grain ran out. There was no choice but to return to Egypt, and this time they would have to bring Benjamin. Judah, who had suggested selling Joseph to the Ishmaelites so many years before, now stepped forward to guarantee Benjamin's safety. "Send the boy with me," he urged his father, "and we will arise and go, that we may live and not die, both we and you, and also our little ones. I will be a pledge of his safety. From my hand you shall require him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then let me bear the blame forever." Something in Judah's voice, some quality of genuine commitment and transformed character, convinced Jacob at last. "If it must be so," he said, "then do this. Take some of the choice fruits of the land in your bags and carry a present down to the man, a little balm and a little honey, gum, myrrh, pistachio nuts, and almonds. Take double the money with you, and carry back with you the money that was returned in the mouth of your sacks. Perhaps it was an oversight. Take also your brother, and arise, go again to the man. May God Almighty grant you mercy before the man, so that he may send back your other brother and Benjamin. And as for me, if I am bereaved of my children, I am bereaved." When the brothers returned to Egypt with Benjamin, Joseph saw them and was deeply moved. This was his full brother, the only other son of Rachel, now grown to manhood. Joseph commanded his steward to bring the men to his house and prepare a feast, for they would dine with him at noon. The brothers were frightened when they were brought to Joseph's house, thinking they were being arrested because of the money that had been returned in their sacks. They tried to explain to the steward about the money, but he reassured them. "Peace to you, do not be afraid. Your God and the God of your father has put treasure in your sacks for you. I received your money." Then he brought Simeon out to them. When Joseph came home, they presented their gifts to him and bowed down to the ground before him. Again Joseph saw his boyhood dreams being fulfilled, but now the sight brought him no pride, only a deep sadness for all the pain that had led to this moment. "Is your father well, the old man of whom you spoke?" Joseph asked. "Is he still alive?" "Your servant our father is well. He is still alive," they replied, and they bowed their heads and prostrated themselves. When Joseph saw Benjamin, his own mother's son, his heart nearly broke. "Is this your youngest brother, of whom you spoke to me?" he asked, and then, fighting to control his voice, he said, "God be gracious to you, my son." Joseph hurried out of the room, seeking a place to weep, for his compassion grew warm toward his brother, and he sought a place to weep. He entered his chamber and wept there. The feast that followed was strange and wonderful. Joseph had the brothers seated according to their birth order, from the oldest to the youngest, which amazed them greatly. How could this Egyptian governor know such details about their family? Benjamin's portion was 5 times larger than any of the others, another echo of the favoritism that had caused so much trouble in their youth. But Joseph was not finished testing his brothers. He wanted to know if they had truly changed, if they would treat Benjamin as they had once treated him, if jealousy and resentment still ruled their hearts. So he commanded his steward to fill their sacks with grain and put each man's money back in his sack. But in Benjamin's sack he placed something more, his own silver cup, the cup from which he drank and by which he practiced divination. The brothers departed early in the morning, but they had not gone far when Joseph's steward overtook them. "Why have you repaid evil for good?" he demanded. "Is it not from this that my lord drinks, and by this that he practices divination? You have done evil in what you have done." The brothers were incredulous. "Far be it from your servants that they should do such a thing," they protested. "Behold, the money that we found in the mouths of our sacks we brought back to you from the land of Canaan." How then could we steal silver or gold from your Lord's house? Whichever of your servants is found with it shall die, and we also will be my Lord's servants." But when the sacks were searched, and the cup was found in Benjamin's sack, the brothers tore their clothes in grief and despair. They had promised their father to protect Benjamin, and now it seemed they had failed. They loaded their donkeys and returned to the city, where they fell before Joseph on the ground. "What deed is this that you have done?" Joseph demanded. "Do you not know that a man like me can indeed practice divination?" Then Judah stepped forward, and in the words he spoke, Joseph heard the voice of a man completely transformed from the brother who had once suggested selling him into slavery. "What shall we say to my lord?" Judah asked. "What shall we speak? Or how can we clear ourselves? God has found out the guilt of your servants. Behold, we are my Lord's servants, both we and he, also in whose hand the cup has been found." But Joseph said, "Far be it from me that I should do so. Only the man in whose hand the cup was found shall be my servant. But as for you, go up in peace to your father." This was the ultimate test. Would the brothers abandon Benjamin as they had once abandoned Joseph? Would they return to their father with another tale of loss, another beloved son gone forever? Judah's response revealed just how completely he had been transformed by the years of guilt and grief. He approached Joseph and said, "O my lord, please let your servant speak a word in my lord's ears, and let not your anger burn against your servant, for you are like Pharaoh himself." Nati. Then he told the whole story, how their father had loved 2 sons of his old age, how one had perished, and how the father's life was bound up in the life of the remaining boy. "Now therefore," Judah concluded, "if I come to your servant my father, and the boy is not with us, then, as his life is bound up in the boy's life, as soon as he sees that the boy is not with us, he will die, and your servants will bring down the grey hairs of your servant our father with sorrow to Sheol. For your servant became a pledge of safety for the boy to my father, saying, 'If I do not bring him back to you, then I shall bear the blame before my father forever. Now therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the boy as a servant to my lord, and let the boy go back with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? I fear to see the evil that would find my father." In these words, Joseph heard everything he needed to know. Judah was willing to sacrifice himself for Benjamin, to become a slave so that his brother could go free. The man who had once been willing to sell Joseph for 20 pieces of silver was now ready to give up his own freedom to protect another brother. The transformation was complete, the test was passed, and Joseph could no longer contain himself. "Make everyone go out from me," Joseph commanded his servants. So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud so that the Egyptians heard it, and Pharaoh's household heard it. "I am Joseph," he said to his brothers. "Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. The shock was too great, the revelation too overwhelming. This powerful Egyptian governor, this man who had held their lives in his hands, was the brother they had betrayed and sold into slavery more than 20 years before. Joseph saw their terror and spoke gently to them. "Come near to me, please." And when they came near, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life." In those words lay the heart of true forgiveness, not just the releasing of anger, but the reframing of past hurts within a larger story of divine purpose and grace. Joseph had learned to see his suffering not as meaningless cruelty, but as part of a greater plan to save not just his own family, but countless lives throughout the region. "For the famine has been in the land these 2 years," Joseph continued, "and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither ploughing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God." He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt." This was forgiveness of the highest order, forgiveness that did not minimize the wrong that had been done, but placed it within a context so much larger that the wrong itself became transformed into good. Joseph was not saying that his brothers' actions had been right, but that God had worked through even their evil intentions to accomplish something beautiful and life-giving. The brothers stood in stunned silence, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were hearing. The brother they had betrayed had become their savior. The one they had sold into slavery had risen to power sufficient to save their lives. The boy whose dreams had so angered them had seen those dreams fulfilled in ways that brought blessing rather than revenge. "Hurry and go up to my father," Joseph urged them, "and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not tarry. You shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children, and your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. There I will provide for you, for there are yet 5 years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have do not come to poverty.' Then Joseph fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept upon his neck, and he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them, and after that his brothers talked with him. The tears that flowed were tears of healing, washing away decades of guilt and grief, dissolving the barriers that had separated them for so long. When the news reached Pharaoh's house that Joseph's brothers had come, it pleased Pharaoh and his servants. Pharaoh himself told Joseph, "Say to your brothers, 'Do this. Load your beasts and go back to the land of Canaan, and take your father and your households and come to me, and I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you shall eat the fat of the land.' And you, Joseph, are commanded to say, 'Do this. Take wagons from the land of Egypt for your little ones and for your wives, and bring your father, and come.'" So the brothers set out for Canaan, their hearts light with joy and wonder, their wagons loaded with gifts and provisions. They carried with them not just grain and goods, but the most precious cargo of all, the news that Joseph was alive, that he was well, that he forgave them, and that he wanted them to come and live near him in Egypt. When they reached their father and told him, "Joseph is still alive, and he is ruler over all the land of Egypt," Jacob's heart fainted, for he did not believe them. But when they told him all the words of Joseph that he had said to them, and when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. "It is enough," Israel said. "Joseph, my son, is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." The journey to Egypt was like a reversal of all the sorrowful journeys that had come before. Jacob's flight from Esau, Joseph's forced march into slavery, the brothers' guilty trips to buy grain. This time the whole family travelled together in joy, moving toward reunion rather than separation, toward blessing rather than curse. When they reached Goshen, Joseph prepared his chariot and went up to meet Israel his father. When he presented himself to him, he fell on his neck and wept on his neck a good while. And Israel said to Joseph, "Now let me die, since I have seen your face and know that you are still alive." The reunion between father and son was profoundly moving, the culmination of decades of grief transformed into overwhelming joy. Jacob had mourned Joseph as dead for 22 years, carrying that sorrow like a stone in his chest. Now, to see his beloved son alive and prosperous, to hold him in his arms again, seemed like resurrection itself. Joseph settled his family in the land of Goshen, the best part of Egypt, where they could maintain their way of life as shepherds, while being protected and provided for during the remaining years of famine. He presented 5 of his brothers to Pharaoh, who was impressed by their strength and bearing, and appointed them as overseers of his own livestock. As the years passed in Egypt, the family that had been broken by jealousy and betrayal became whole again. The brothers learned to work together, to trust each other, to put the welfare of the family above their individual ambitions. They saw how Joseph used his power not for personal gain, but for the good of others, how he had learned to forgive completely and love unconditionally. When Jacob was about to die, he called all his sons to him and blessed each one according to his character and destiny. To Judah, who had offered himself as a slave to save Benjamin, he gave the promise of kingship. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. Of Joseph he said, Joseph is a fruitful vine by a spring. His branches run over the wall. The archers bitterly attacked him, shot at him, and harassed him severely, yet his bow remained unmoved. His arms were made agile by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. The blessings of your father are mighty beyond the blessings of my parents, up to the bounties of the everlasting hills. May they be on the head of Joseph, and on the brow of him who was set apart from his brothers. After Jacob's death, the brothers were afraid that Joseph might finally seek revenge now that their father was gone. They sent a message to him saying, Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, Please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin, for they did evil to you. And now, please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. When Joseph received this message, he wept, grieved that his brothers still doubted his forgiveness after all these years. When they came to him and fell down before him, saying, Behold, we are your servants, Joseph said to them, Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones. These words represent perhaps the most complete expression of forgiveness found anywhere in human literature. Joseph acknowledged that his brothers had indeed meant evil against him. He did not minimize their sin or pretend it had not happened, but he was able to see beyond their intentions to God's purposes, to understand that divine grace could transform even the most malicious actions into instruments of blessing. God meant it for good. These 5 words contain a theology of redemption that has sustained countless people through their darkest hours. They proclaim that no evil is so great that God cannot bring good from it, no hurt so deep that grace cannot heal it, no enemy so bitter that love cannot transform them into a friend. Joseph lived to be 110 years old, long enough to see his great-great-grandchildren and to watch his family grow into a great nation. Before he died, he gathered his brothers around him and said, I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. He made them swear that when that day came, they would carry his bones with them, for even in death he wanted to be part of the journey back to the promised land. The story of Joseph and his brothers became a cornerstone of faith for generations to come, proof that reconciliation is always possible, that forgiveness can overcome any betrayal, that God's purposes can triumph over human malice. It showed that the path from enmity to brotherhood might be long and difficult, marked by suffering and testing, but that those who walk it faithfully will find at its end not just reconciliation, but transformation. The brothers who had once been willing to kill their sibling became men willing to die for each other. The favoritism that had poisoned their childhood gave way to genuine love and mutual respect. The dreams that had seemed like arrogant boasting were revealed to be divine prophecies pointing toward a future none of them could have imagined. Their story echoes through the ages, speaking to every family divided by jealousy, every relationship broken by betrayal, every heart hardened by unforgiveness. It whispers hope to those who think they have gone too far to return, who believe their actions have placed them beyond the reach of grace. It proclaims that no prodigal is too lost to come home, no enemy too bitter to become a brother, no wound too deep to heal. In the embrace of Joseph and his brothers, we see reflected the greater embrace of divine love that reaches toward all humanity, the cosmic reconciliation that transforms enemies into friends, strangers into family, broken relationships into testimonies of grace. Their tears of reunion become our tears of hope, their joy our joy, their forgiveness a promise that we too can find our way back to the love we thought we had lost forever. The journey from the pit to the palace, from betrayal to blessing, from enmity to brotherhood, remains one of the most powerful narratives of redemption ever told. It reminds us that our stories are not finished when we fail, that our relationships are not doomed when they are damaged, that our futures are not determined by our pasts. In the hands of divine grace, even our worst moments can become the raw material for our greatest triumphs. Even our deepest hurts can become the foundation for our most profound healing. The echoes of this ancient drama of reconciliation would resonate through the generations, inspiring new stories of forgiveness and transformation. Centuries later, in the same land where Joseph had once dreamed his prophetic dreams, another young man would face his own tests of character, his own journey from obscurity to prominence, his own struggle with an older, more powerful figure who would become his enemy before, perhaps becoming something more. David was a shepherd boy, the youngest of 8 sons, tending his father's flocks in the hills around Bethlehem when the prophet Samuel came looking for Israel's next king. The prophet had been sent by God to anoint one of Jesse's sons, but when he saw the older brothers, tall, strong, impressive in their bearing, he assumed one of them must be the chosen one. Yet God's voice came clear and certain. Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. 7 sons passed before Samuel, and each was rejected. Finally the prophet asked, "Are all your sons here?" Jesse remembered his youngest, out in the fields with the sheep, and sent for him. When David arrived, ruddy and handsome, with beautiful eyes and a youthful vigour that spoke of hours spent in the open air, God said to Samuel, "Arise, anoint him, for this is he." The oil that Samuel poured upon David's head was more than a ritual. It was a transformation, a marking, a setting apart for destiny. From that day forward, the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David, filling him with wisdom beyond his years, courage beyond his size, and a heart that sought after God's own heart. But the same Spirit that came upon David departed from Saul, the current king of Israel. What had begun as a reign of promise had deteriorated into a cycle of disobedience and divine displeasure. Saul, who had once been humble and reluctant to accept the crown, had grown proud and willful, making decisions based on fear rather than faith, on political expedience rather than divine command. As the Spirit left Saul, a harmful spirit troubled him, bringing depression and rage, paranoia and despair. His servants, seeing their king's distress, suggested that music might soothe his tormented soul. "Let our Lord now command your servants who are before you to seek out a man who is skillful in playing the lyre," they said. "And when the harmful spirit from God is upon you, he will play it, and you will be well." The recommendation came quickly. "Behold, I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing, a man of valour, a man of war, prudent in speech, and a man of good presence, and the Lord is with him." So David was brought to Saul's court, and whenever the king was troubled, the young shepherd would take up his harp and play. The music that flowed from his fingers was more than melody. It was medicine for the soul, carrying within it the peace of hillsides and starlight, the comfort of divine presence, the assurance of hope. Under the influence of David's music, the harmful spirit would depart from Saul, and he would be refreshed and well. For a time, there was harmony between the aging king and the young musician. Saul loved David greatly, and David served him faithfully, finding in the older man a father figure, a mentor, a source of wisdom and guidance. David became Saul's armor-bearer, a position of trust and intimacy, and it seemed as if their relationship might be one of mutual blessing and support. The crisis came when the Philistines gathered their armies for war and camped between Soko and Azekah. Among their warriors was a giant named Goliath, over 9 feet tall, whose bronze armor alone weighed more than most men could carry. Day after day, he would stride out between the armies and issue his challenge. "Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." For 40 days Goliath issued his challenge, and for 40 days no Israelite warrior dared to face him. Even Saul, tall and mighty though he was, remained in his tent, paralyzed by fear of the giant's size and strength. David had returned to Bethlehem to tend his father's sheep, but when Jesse sent him to the battle lines with supplies for his older brothers, he heard Goliath's challenge and was amazed that no one had accepted it. "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine," he asked, "that he should defy the armies of the living God?" His oldest brother Eliab heard him speaking and was angry. "Why have you come down?" he demanded. "And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart. You have come down to see the battle." But David was not deterred. Word of his questions reached Saul, who summoned the young man to his presence. "Let no man's heart fail because of him," David said boldly. "Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Saul looked at the youth standing before him, smooth-faced, slender, carrying no weapon but a sling, and shook his head. "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him," he said gently, "for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." But David had faced dangers before in the quiet hills outside Bethlehem. "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father," he replied. "And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." Something in David's voice, some quality of absolute conviction and fearless faith, convinced Saul. "Go," he said, "and the Lord be with you." He clothed David with his own armor, put a bronze helmet on his head, and clothed him with a coat of mail. But when David tried to walk in the unfamiliar gear, he found it cumbersome and restrictive. "I cannot go with these," David said, "for I have not tested them." So he put them off and took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the brook, put them in his shepherd's pouch, and with his sling in his hand he approached the Philistine. When Goliath saw David coming toward him, he was insulted. "Am I a dog," he roared, "that you come to me with sticks?" He cursed David by his gods and promised to give his flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. But David's response rang out clear and strong across the valley. "You come to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air, and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." With those words, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. He put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, slung it, and struck Goliath in the forehead. the stone sank deep into the giant's skull, and he fell face down on the ground. With no sword in his hand, David had prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, striking him down and killing him. The victory was complete and decisive. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled, and the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued them. David took Goliath's sword and cut off his head, carrying it back as proof of his triumph. But the victory that should have brought joy to Saul's heart instead planted the first seeds of jealousy and fear. As the army returned from battle, the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing, to meet King Saul with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated, "Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s." The song cut through Saul like a blade. "They have ascribed to David 10,000s," he said angrily, "and to me they have ascribed thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom?" From that day forward, Saul eyed David with suspicion and growing hostility. The next day, as David played his harp to soothe Saul's troubled spirit, the harmful spirit rushed upon the king with unusual violence. In his hand was a spear, and as the music filled the room, a sudden rage seized him. "I will pin David to the wall," he thought, and he hurled the spear with all his might. But David evaded it, not once but twice, slipping away from death by inches. From that moment, Saul was afraid of David, because he could see that the Lord was with the young man and had departed from himself. The very qualities that had once endeared David to him, his faith, his courage, his evident divine blessing, now tormented Saul with reminders of his own spiritual decline. Rather than kill David openly, Saul devised a more subtle plan. He removed David from his position as armor-bearer and made him a commander of 1,000 men, hoping that the dangers of battle would accomplish what his own spear had failed to do. But David continued to succeed in all his undertakings, and his fame and popularity only grew. Saul offered David his daughter Merab in marriage, but when the time came for the wedding, he gave her to another man instead. Then Michal, Saul's younger daughter, fell in love with David, and when Saul heard of it, he was pleased, thinking, "Let me give her to him, that she may be a snare for him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him." The bride price Saul demanded was dangerous in the extreme, 100 foreskins of the Philistines. "The king desires no bride price except 100 foreskins of the Philistines," Saul's servants told David, "that he may be avenged of the king's enemies." Saul thought surely this would result in David's death, but David and his men went out and killed 200 Philistines, and David brought their foreskins and gave them in full number to the king. Every scheme Saul devised to destroy David only served to elevate him further. The more the king raged against him, the more obvious it became to everyone that David was blessed by God and destined for greatness. Saul's own son Jonathan recognized this and formed a covenant of friendship with David that would endure despite all his father's attempts to turn him against the young hero. Finally, Saul abandoned all pretense and spoke openly to Jonathan and to all his servants about killing David. But Jonathan warned David of his father's intentions, and David was forced to flee for his life. The young man who had once soothed Saul's spirit with music, who had served him faithfully as armor-bearer, who had married his daughter and befriended his son, was now a fugitive, hunted through the wilderness like a wild animal. Thus began a cat-and-mouse game that would last for years, with Saul pursuing David through the desert regions of Judah, while David gathered around himself a band of outcasts and misfits who found in him a leader worth following. They lived in caves and strongholds, always moving, always watching for Saul's approach, sustained by David's unwavering faith that God would protect him and eventually fulfill the promise of kingship that Samuel had spoken over him so many years before. The relationship between Saul and David had begun with love and mutual respect, but it had been poisoned by jealousy, fear, and spiritual darkness. The older man, who should have been a mentor, became a persecutor. The father figure became an enemy. The king, who should have recognized and nurtured David's gifts, instead sought to destroy him. Yet even as Saul hunted him relentlessly, David maintained a deep respect for the man who had been anointed as God's king. He refused to speak evil of Saul or to raise his hand against him, even when given opportunities to do so. In David's heart, the relationship between them was not yet finished, not yet beyond redemption. The story of their enmity was still being written, and its final chapters would reveal truths about mercy and grace that would echo through the ages. The wilderness of En-Gedi was a harsh and desolate place, a landscape of cliffs and caves carved by wind and water into a maze of hiding places. It was here that David and his men sought refuge, moving like shadows through the rocky terrain, always listening for the sound of pursuing horses, always ready to disappear into the labyrinth of stone that had become their sanctuary. Word reached Saul that David was in the wilderness of En-Gedi, and the king gathered 3,000 chosen men from all Israel and set out in pursuit. The hunt had become an obsession for Saul, consuming his thoughts and driving him to pursue his former armor-bearer with the intensity of a man possessed. He would not rest until David was dead and the threat to his throne eliminated. As Saul's army combed the wilderness, the king himself stepped aside into a cave to relieve himself, not knowing that David and his men were hiding in the very depths of that same cave. It was a moment of perfect vulnerability, a chance encounter that seemed orchestrated by divine providence. Here was the man who had tried to pin David to the wall with a spear, who had driven him into exile, who had turned his life into one of constant flight and fear, sitting alone and defenseless just a few feet away. David's men saw the opportunity and whispered urgently to their leader, "Here is the day of which the Lord said to you, 'Behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it shall seem good to you.'" It would be so easy, so justified, so final. One quick thrust of a blade, and all their troubles would be over. David would be king, as God had promised, and Saul's reign of increasingly erratic and violent behavior would come to an end. But David's heart was moved by something deeper than self-preservation or political ambition. As he crept silently toward the unsuspecting king, his hand went not to his sword, but to his knife, and with infinite care he cut off a corner of Saul's robe without the king knowing it. Even this small act made David's heart strike him, and he said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed." David's men could scarcely believe what they were hearing. Here was their chance to end their exile, to claim the throne that God had promised David, to eliminate the threat that had hung over them for so long. But David would not be moved. "Shall I put out my hand against the Lord's anointed?" he asked them again, and his conviction was so absolute that they dared not argue further. When Saul rose and left the cave, continuing his search, David waited a moment and then followed him out. "My lord the king," he called, and when Saul turned around, David bowed with his face to the earth and paid homage. "Why do you listen to the words of men who say, 'Behold, David seeks your harm'?" David asked. "Behold, this day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you today into my hand in the cave. And some told me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, 'I will not put out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed.'" To prove his point, David held up the corner of Saul's robe that he had cut off. "See, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand," he said. "For by the fact that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you, you may know and see that there is no wrong or treason in my hands. I have not sinned against you, though you hunt my life to take it." The words hit Saul like a physical blow. Here was proof positive that David could have killed him, but had chosen mercy instead. The young man he had been hunting was calling him father, was showing him respect and honor, even while being pursued like a criminal. The magnitude of David's grace was overwhelming. "Is this your voice, my son David?" Saul called out, and he lifted up his voice and wept. "You are more righteous than I," he admitted, "for you have repaid me good, whereas I have repaid you evil. And you have declared this day how you have dealt well with me, in that you did not kill me when the Lord put me into your hands. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safe? So may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day." In that moment of tearful recognition, Saul saw clearly what he had become and what David had remained. His jealousy and fear had transformed him into a persecutor of innocence, while David's faith and integrity had kept him from becoming the very thing Saul feared he was, a usurper and murderer. "And now, behold, I know that you shall surely be king," Saul continued, "and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Swear to me therefore by the Lord that you will not cut off my offspring after me, and that you will not destroy my name out of my father's house." David swore the oath gladly, and for a moment it seemed as if their reconciliation was complete. Saul went home, and David and his men returned to their stronghold. But the peace was fragile and temporary. Saul's recognition of David's righteousness, though genuine in the moment, could not overcome the deeper spiritual and psychological forces that drove his persecution. The harmful spirit that troubled him was stronger than his moments of clarity, and his jealousy ran deeper than his gratitude. Within months, Saul was hunting David again, driven by reports that his enemy was hiding in the wilderness of Ziph. Once again, he gathered 3,000 chosen men and set out in pursuit. And once again, Providence arranged an encounter that would test the very depths of David's character. This time, David and his nephew Abishai crept into Saul's camp at night and found the king lying asleep, with his spear stuck in the ground at his head, and his general Abner and all his men sleeping around him. It was an even more perfect opportunity than the cave at En-Gedi. Saul was completely helpless, surrounded by his own guards who had failed in their most basic duty. Abishai saw the chance and urged David to take it. "God has given your enemy into your hand this day," he whispered. "Now please let me pin him to the earth with one stroke of the spear, and I will not strike him twice." But David's response was the same as it had been in the cave. "Do not destroy him," he said, "for who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? As the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him, or his day will come to die, or he will go down into battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I should put out my hand against the Lord's anointed." Instead of taking Saul's life, David took his spear and his jar of water and slipped away into the night. When they had climbed to the top of a hill far from the camp, David called out across the valley to Abner, mocking him for his failure to protect the king. "Why then have you not kept watch over your lord the king?" David shouted. "For one of the people came in to destroy the king your lord. This thing that you have done is not good. As the Lord lives, you deserve to die, because you have not kept watch over your lord, the Lord's anointed. And now see where the king's spear is and the jar of water that was at his head." Saul recognized David's voice and called out, "Is this your voice, my son David?" "It is my voice, my lord, O king," David replied. "Why does my lord pursue after his servant? For what have I done? What evil is on my hands? Now therefore let my lord the king hear the words of his servant. If it is the Lord who has stirred you up against me, may he accept an offering. But if it is men, may they be cursed before the Lord, for they have driven me out this day that I should have no share in the heritage of the Lord, saying, 'Go, serve other gods.' Now therefore, let not my blood fall to the earth away from the presence of the Lord, for the king of Israel has come out to seek a single flea like one who hunts a partridge in the mountains." Again Saul was moved to confession and repentance. "I have sinned," he admitted. "Return, my son David, for I will no more do you harm, because my life was precious in your eyes this day. Behold, I have acted foolishly and have made a great mistake." David held up the king's spear for all to see. "Here is the spear, O king," he called. "Let one of the young men come over and take it. The Lord rewards every man for his righteousness and his faithfulness. For the Lord gave you into my hand today, and I would not put out my hand against the Lord's anointed. Behold, as your life was precious this day in my sight, so may my life be precious in the sight of the Lord, and may he deliver me out of all tribulation." Saul's response was filled with prophetic insight. "Blessed be you, my son David. You will do many things and will succeed in them." Then Saul went his way, and David went his way, but both men knew that their paths would not cross again in peace. These two encounters, the cave at En-Gedi and the night raid on Saul's camp, revealed the extraordinary depth of David's character. Twice he had been given perfect opportunities to eliminate his enemy, to claim the throne that God had promised him, to end his years of exile and danger. Twice he had chosen mercy over vengeance, patience over expediency, faith over self-preservation. David's refusal to harm Saul was not mere political calculation or strategic thinking. It was rooted in a profound understanding of divine authority and human responsibility. Even though Saul had failed as a king, even though God's Spirit had departed from him, he remained the Lord's anointed until God himself removed him. David would not presume to take into his own hands what belonged to divine prerogative. More than that, David's mercy revealed a heart that had learned to see beyond immediate circumstances to eternal principles. He understood that how he gained the throne would affect how he held it, that the methods he used to achieve power would shape the kind of king he became. A throne gained through murder, even justified murder, would be tainted from the beginning. Saul, for his part, was faced with the overwhelming evidence of David's righteousness and his own moral failure. In those moments when he saw clearly, when the harmful spirit released its grip on his mind, he recognized the nobility of the young man he was pursuing and the futility of his opposition to God's will. But these moments of clarity were brief and fragile, overwhelmed by the darkness that had taken root in his heart. The tragedy of Saul was that he could see the truth but could not act upon it consistently. He could acknowledge David's righteousness but could not stop pursuing him. He could confess his own sins but could not repent of them permanently. He was trapped in a cycle of recognition and relapse, wisdom and folly, that would ultimately destroy him. David's mercy towards Saul became legendary, a standard of gracious behavior that would inspire leaders for generations to come. He had learned that true strength is shown not in the ability to destroy one's enemies, but in the wisdom to spare them when they are vulnerable. He had discovered that the greatest victories are sometimes achieved not through conquest, but through restraint, not through taking action, but through refusing to act. The relationship between David and Saul never achieved the full reconciliation that marked the stories of Jacob and Esau, or Joseph and his brothers. Saul's spiritual condition made lasting peace impossible, and David's safety required that he keep his distance from the unstable king. But David's conduct towards Saul established principles of mercy and respect for authority that would echo through the ages. In David's restraint, we see the possibility of rising above our circumstances, of responding to evil with good, of breaking cycles of violence and revenge. His example shows us that enemies need not remain enemies forever, that grace can triumph over grievance, that mercy can be more powerful than the sword. Even when reconciliation is not possible, respect and honor can still be maintained, and the seeds of future peace can be planted in the soil of present grace. The echoes of these ancient stories of conflict and reconciliation would continue to resonate centuries later in a world transformed by the message of Jesus Christ. The early Christian church was a revolutionary community, bringing together people from vastly different backgrounds, Jews and Gentiles, slaves and free, rich and poor, all united by their common faith in the risen Saviour. Yet even in this community of grace, human nature remained unchanged, and conflicts arose that tested the very foundations of Christian brotherhood. Among the leaders of this early church were two remarkable men whose partnership had helped spread the gospel across the known world. Paul, formerly known as Saul, had been the church's greatest persecutor before becoming its most passionate apostle. His transformation from enemy to advocate was itself a testament to the power of divine grace. Barnabas, whose name meant son of encouragement, had been instrumental in Paul's acceptance by the suspicious Christian community and had become his closest partner in ministry. Their friendship had been forged in the fires of missionary work, strengthened by shared dangers and common purpose. Together they had travelled through Cyprus and southern Asia Minor, preaching in synagogues and marketplaces, establishing churches in hostile territory, enduring persecution and hardship for the sake of the gospel. They had worked as a team, complementing each other's gifts, supporting each other through trials, celebrating together the miraculous growth of the early church. Barnabas was a Levite from Cyprus, a man of property who had sold his land and given the proceeds to the apostles for distribution to the poor. He possessed a gentle spirit and a generous heart, quick to see potential in others, eager to give second chances, naturally inclined toward mercy and restoration. His very presence seemed to bring peace to tense situations and hope to discouraged hearts. Paul, by contrast, was intense and driven, a man of passionate convictions and unwavering determination. His conversion on the road to Damascus had redirected but not diminished the zeal that had once made him the church's fiercest opponent. Now that same intensity burned for the gospel, driving him to push boundaries, challenge traditions, and pursue his calling with single-minded focus. Their differences had been a source of strength in their ministry together. Barnabas's gentle spirit balanced Paul's intensity, while Paul's drive complemented Barnabas's tendency toward patience and accommodation. They had learned to work together effectively, trusting each other's judgment, respecting each other's gifts, united in their commitment to spreading the good news of Jesus Christ. But it was precisely these differences in temperament and approach that would eventually drive them apart. The conflict arose over a young man named John Mark, Barnabas's cousin, who had accompanied them on their first missionary journey. Mark had started the journey with enthusiasm, but when they reached Perga in Pamphylia, he had suddenly left them and returned to Jerusalem. The reasons for his departure were never fully explained. Perhaps the hardships were greater than he had expected. Perhaps family obligations called him home. Perhaps fear overcame his initial courage. Whatever the reason, Mark's departure had left Paul feeling betrayed and abandoned. In Paul's mind, missionary work was not a casual endeavour, but a sacred calling that demanded total commitment. To leave in the middle of a mission was not just disappointing, but dangerous. It could undermine the work, discourage local believers, and set a precedent for others to abandon their posts when things became difficult. When the time came to embark on a second missionary journey, Barnabas wanted to give Mark another chance. "Let us return and visit the brothers in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they are," he suggested to Paul. It seemed like a natural partnership, the same team that had worked so effectively before, returning to encourage and strengthen the churches they had established. But when Barnabas proposed taking Mark with them again, Paul's response was immediate and emphatic. No. The young man who had deserted them once could not be trusted with such important work again. Paul had seen too much, invested too much, sacrificed too much for the gospel to risk having it undermined by someone whose commitment had already proven unreliable. "He left us in Pamphylia," Paul reminded Barnabas. "He did not go with us to the work. How can we depend on him now?" Barnabas saw the situation differently. In his mind, Mark's earlier failure was exactly why he needed another opportunity. The young man had made a mistake, yes, but that didn't mean he was permanently disqualified from service. Everyone deserved a second chance. Everyone had the potential for growth and change. Wasn't that at the very heart of the gospel message? That failures could be redeemed, that sinners could be transformed, that God's grace was sufficient for every weakness? People change, Barnabas argued. Mark has grown since then. He's learned from his mistake. He won't make the same error again. But Paul was unmoved. His concern was not personal animosity toward Mark, but practical wisdom about the mission. They would be entering hostile territory, facing dangers and hardships that would test everyone's resolve. They needed team members who had proven their reliability under pressure, not those who had already demonstrated a tendency to quit when things became difficult. The work is too important, Paul insisted. We cannot afford to have someone abandon us again at a crucial moment. The churches we're going to visit depend on us. The people we'll meet need to see strength and commitment, not uncertainty and unreliability. The disagreement grew sharper with each exchange. Barnabas, true to his nature as a son of encouragement, could not bear the thought of excluding Mark permanently because of one mistake. His entire ministry had been built on seeing potential where others saw only problems, on offering hope where others saw only failure. To refuse Mark a second chance would violate everything Barnabas believed about grace and redemption. Paul, with his characteristic intensity and logical mind, could not understand how Barnabas could ignore the practical realities of their situation. They were not running a rehabilitation program, but a missionary enterprise with eternal consequences. The gospel demanded the highest standards of commitment and reliability. Personal feelings and family loyalties had to be subordinated to the greater good of the mission. The discussion became an argument, the argument became a sharp disagreement, and the sharp disagreement became what the scripture simply calls a sharp contention. The Greek word used suggests a bitter emotional conflict that cut to the heart of their relationship. These two men who had been partners in ministry, friends in danger, brothers in the gospel, found themselves on opposite sides of an issue that neither could abandon without feeling he was betraying his deepest convictions. Barnabas could not bring himself to exclude his young cousin from the mission. His very nature rebelled against such harshness, and his understanding of Christian grace demanded that Mark be given another opportunity to prove himself. To refuse would be to deny the very mercy that had transformed their own lives. Paul could not bring himself to risk the mission for the sake of personal relationships. His calling as an apostle required him to put the advancement of the gospel above all other considerations. To include Mark would be to compromise the effectiveness of their work and potentially endanger the churches they were meant to serve. The contention was so sharp that they could not resolve it through discussion or compromise. There seemed to be no middle ground between Barnabas's insistence on grace and Paul's demand for proven reliability. Two good men, both motivated by love for Christ and commitment to his mission, found themselves unable to work together because of their different approaches to the same problem. In the end, they did what seemed impossible. They separated. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed to Cyprus, his homeland, where perhaps his gentler approach would be more appreciated, and Mark's restoration could proceed at a more gradual pace. Paul chose Silas as his new partner and went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches with his characteristic energy and determination. The separation was painful for both men, but it was not permanent. Unlike the conflicts we have seen in earlier stories, this disagreement was not rooted in jealousy or hatred, but in different philosophies of ministry and leadership. Both men continued to serve the same Lord, preach the same gospel, and work toward the same ultimate goal. Their paths had diverged, but their destination remained the same. Years passed, and time brought the perspective and maturity that immediate circumstances had obscured. Paul's ministry continued to flourish, taking him through Asia Minor and into Europe, establishing churches in Philippi, Thessalonica, Corinth, and eventually Rome itself. His letters to these churches would become treasured parts of the New Testament. His theological insights would shape Christian doctrine for centuries to come. Barnabas, too, continued his work of encouragement and church building, though less is recorded of his later ministry. His investment in Mark, however, would prove to be one of his greatest contributions to the early church. Under Barnabas's patient mentoring, the young man who had once abandoned his post grew into a reliable and effective minister of the gospel. The vindication of Barnabas's approach came years later, when Paul himself acknowledged Mark's value. Writing to the Colossians, Paul sent greetings from Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, and added instructions that if Mark came to them, they should welcome him. The very man Paul had once considered unreliable was now trusted enough to be commended to other churches. Even more significant was Paul's request near the end of his life, when he was imprisoned in Rome and facing possible execution. Writing to Timothy, he made a remarkable statement. "Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is very useful to me for ministry." The young man who had once been deemed unfit for missionary work had become someone Paul specifically wanted by his side in his final days. This transformation did not happen overnight or accidentally. It was the fruit of Barnabas's patient investment in Mark's life, the result of giving him the second chance that Paul had been unwilling to provide. Mark had indeed learned from his earlier failure, had grown in maturity and commitment, had proven himself worthy of trust through years of faithful service. The conflict between Paul and Barnabas teaches us that good people can disagree about important matters without becoming enemies, that separation is sometimes necessary when fundamental approaches to ministry cannot be reconciled, but that such separations need not be permanent or bitter. Both men were right in their own way. Paul was right to demand high standards of commitment, and Barnabas was right to believe in the possibility of redemption and growth. Their story also demonstrates the providence of God in using even conflicts for the advancement of his purposes. What began as a sharp contention that divided one missionary team ended up creating two teams, doubling the evangelistic effort. The disagreement that seemed to threaten the mission actually expanded it, sending the gospel in more directions than would have been possible if Paul and Barnabas had remained together. Most importantly, their eventual reconciliation shows the power of grace to heal even the deepest wounds between brothers in faith. The sharp words spoken in anger, the bitter feelings of disappointment and betrayal, the pain of separation. All these were overcome by the greater reality of their shared love for Christ and commitment to his mission. In the end, both Paul and Barnabas discovered that they needed each other more than they needed to be right about Mark. Paul's intensity and drive were balanced by Barnabas's mercy and patience. Barnabas's gift for restoration was complemented by Paul's passion for excellence. Their differences, which had once divided them, ultimately enriched the entire Christian community.